The call came at 3:15 a.m. Sheriff Miller didn't use the radio. He came to my porch in person. That's never a good sign. "3 of them now, Jack," he said. "All over 18, all from the Hillside district." He didn't have to finish. I already knew. They found a note near the last car. Cut-out letters, old school. Someone was playing a game, and they weren't using a computer to leave a trail. I threw my kit in the back. Miller said the only common link was a dinner at the Marble Throne. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We reached the place before dawn, a high-end joint for people who want to be seen, or people who want to disappear in plain sight. Miller gave me a shirt from the first victim. "Find him, boy," I whispered. Rusty didn't bark. He just pulled the leash toward the delivery ramp. Blind spots. The cameras were angled to see the guests, but they ignored the supplies. Someone knew exactly where the shadows were deepest. A man stepped out. Elias, the storekeeper. He looked like the type who never made a mistake on an invoice. Too calm for a crime scene. My dog doesn't growl at strangers unless they smell like trouble. And right now, Rusty was telling me Elias was more than just a clerk. "We need to see the storage, Elias," I said. He didn't move. He just smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Time to go to work. We started with the kitchen annex. The floor was still wet from a recent cleaning. Rusty's paws left damp prints on the tiles. Miller stayed behind me, his flashlight scanning the ceiling. We were looking for anything out of place. Elias stayed in the corner. He didn't offer help, and he didn't get in the way. Miller asked for the keys to the pantry. Elias handed them over without a word. He seemed more concerned with the time than our presence. Miller opened the heavy freezer door. The dog went in, circled the hanging meat, and came back out. Nothing. "Maybe they weren't here, Jack," Miller whispered. The cold was killing any lingering smells we hoped to find. We spent 40 minutes inside, checked every corner of that basement. The dog didn't give me a single alert. Miller looked at me and sighed. "I have to report this as a dead end," he said, walking to his cruiser. I stood by the truck while Miller drove off to update the station. I wasn't ready to leave. I looked across the road. The cemetery was right there, silent. I noticed a small stone building in the far corner near the back fence. Rusty's head snapped toward the gates. He didn't bark, but his body went rigid. He wasn't looking at the restaurant anymore. He was focused on the headstones, or something moving between them. Miller was gone, but the dog was just starting. I saw Elias. He had come out of a side door of the restaurant and crossed the road. He was walking through the graves with a ring of keys in his hand. He headed straight for that stone shed and disappeared inside. "Stay, boy," I whispered. I watched the shed for 5 minutes, but nobody came out. Miller thought the restaurant was clean, but the dog was telling me the story wasn't over. We'd come back when the sun went down. I returned to the cemetery perimeter at 2:15 a.m., moving through the shadows without a word. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and coming rain. Near the rusted side gate, my flashlight beam caught something Miller had missed in the daylight. Deep, fresh tire ruts were carved into the soft Texas soil, leading directly toward the tool shed. Someone had driven a heavy vehicle through here recently, and they hadn't been careful about hiding the tracks. I knelt down, letting Rusty catch the scent from the churned mud. The dog's ears flattened, and a low, barely audible vibration started in his chest. He recognized the chemical signature from the victim's clothing. This wasn't just a graveyard anymore. It was a delivery route for something much darker than a restaurant's supplies. The stone tool shed stood isolated in the far corner of the grounds, half hidden by overgrown oak trees. From a distance, it looked like a crumbling relic, but up close, the structure was unnervingly solid. I ran my hand over the doorframe and felt the cold touch of reinforced steel. The lock was a high-grade security cylinder, far too expensive for a simple groundskeeper's shed. It was designed to keep people out, or perhaps to keep something very important in. Rusty paced back and forth in front of the threshold, his breathing becoming rhythmic and heavy. He wasn't barking, but his entire body was as tense as a coiled spring. He could hear something deep inside the masonry that my ears couldn't pick up. I gripped the pry bar, calculating the noise, and waited for the wind to howl. The door yielded with a muffled click, swinging open on perfectly greased hinges. Inside, the shed was clinical and organized, completely devoid of the usual garden clutter. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on a professional workbench bolted to the floor. There were no shovels or bags of lime here. Instead, I saw a neat stack of local newspapers with dozens of rectangular holes cut out of the headlines. It was a workshop for a phantom. A pair of sharp, surgical-grade scissors sat precisely in the center of the table. This was where the ransom notes were born. Elias was carefully constructing his demands in the dead of night, surrounded by silence and stone. I realized then that he wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a meticulous planner who treated his crimes like an inventory report. I scanned the floor and found a tiny scrap of paper that had escaped the broom. Picking it up with my tweezers, I saw a bold black letter M cut from a story about the missing heirs. But the most damning evidence was the fine dusting of white powder right next to it. I rubbed the grit between my fingers. It wasn't stone dust or dry soil. It was high-grade wheat flour. The exact same substance I had seen on Elias's white apron at the restaurant. The connection was now undeniable. He was bringing the kitchen to the graveyard, unknowingly carrying the evidence of his double life on his very clothes. He thought he was untouchable behind these stone walls, but he had left a trail of flour and paper that led straight to his front door. Rusty's behavior shifted abruptly. He ignored the workbench and lunged toward the back corner of the shed, his claws frantic against the wooden floorboards. He was focused on a space beneath a stack of empty wine crates, the same heavy wooden crates used at the marble throne. I pushed them aside, my breath hitching as I revealed a layer of oil-stained burlap. Underneath was a heavy oak trapdoor, flush with the floor and fitted with a recessed iron ring that had been polished smooth by constant use. The dog began to dig at the seams, a desperate, high-pitched whine escaping his throat. I could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration through the soles of my boots. A mechanical hum was coming from deep within the earth. This wasn't a shed for tools. It was a concealed entrance to a hidden world. I looked at Rusty, and for the first time, I saw a reflection of my own grim resolve in his eyes. He knew exactly what lay beneath us, and his instinct was screaming a warning. I reached down and gripped the cold iron ring, feeling the weight of the secret Elias had buried so carefully. Everything was clear now. The restaurant was the source, the cemetery was the shield, and this trapdoor was the mouth of the cage. Elias wasn't just hiding these people. He was keeping them in a place where their cries for help would be swallowed by the silence of the graves. I checked the service weapon at my hip, took a slow, steadying breath, and prepared for whatever was waiting in the darkness. I pulled the ring, and the heavy oak door groaned as the underground world began to reveal itself. The hatch opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire graveyard. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I gripped the rusted rungs of the ladder and began my descent into the belly of the beast. The air down here was different, colder, heavier, and saturated with the smell of old copper and ozone. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare that Elias had built with his own 2 hands. My flashlight beam cut through the thick, stagnant air, revealing a narrow tunnel carved directly into the limestone. This wasn't a modern basement. It was an old Prohibition-era cellar, expanded and reinforced with modern concrete. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, a steady, rhythmic drum that matched the clicking of Rusty's claws as he waited at the top, guarding the only way out. I moved slowly, keeping my back against the cold stone. About 10 feet in, I noticed something that didn't belong in an old cellar. The walls were lined with professional-grade soundproofing panels, the kind they use in recording studios. One of them was hanging loose, revealing a high-tech nerve center hidden behind the facade. Thick bundles of fiber-optic cables and black wires snaked through the cracks, leading further into the darkness. Elias hadn't just built a prison, he had built a command center. He was running a high-speed operation from under a graveyard, completely invisible to the world above. I realized then that the ransom notes were just the tip of the iceberg. He wasn't just a storekeeper with a side hustle. He was a digital ghost, using this silence to stay off the grid. The level of planning was staggering, and it chilled me more than the cold air. The tunnel ended at a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a high-security vault. Next to it, a small electronic keypad glowed with a faint, malevolent red light. I looked at the buttons. 2, 4, and 9 were slightly more worn than the others. A simple 4-digit code was all that stood between me and the truth. I hesitated for a second, listening. The silence down here was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums. My mind flashed back to the restaurant, to Elias's calm, neutral face as he watched us search the basement. He knew we wouldn't find anything there because he had built his real life here, in the dark. I took a breath, reached out, and pressed the first button. The soft click felt like a gunshot in the stillness of the tomb. The lock disengaged with a hiss of hydraulics, and the door swung open on silent hinges. I stepped into a room that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a kidnapper's den. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing a desk covered in high-end surveillance equipment. A massive monitor dominated the wall, showing live feeds from every corner of the marble throne and the cemetery gates. I saw my own truck parked 2 blocks away. I saw the sheriff's cruiser patrolling the main road. Elias had been watching us the whole time. He had been one step ahead because he had eyes everywhere. On the desk sat a half-eaten steak sandwich and a glass of expensive red wine. He had been sitting here, comfortably, while the families of those kids were falling apart. The cold efficiency of it made my stomach churn. I began to quickly sort through the papers on the desk, careful not to leave a trace. Elias wasn't just a pedant. He was the architect of this chaos. Among restaurant invoices and delivery schedules, I found what I was looking for: an old engineering map of the city's underground utilities. New lines were drawn in red marker, connecting the restaurant's basement, this shed, and several other points beneath the city. He hadn't just found this cellar. He had expanded it, using his employer's resources. The map was covered in numbers and dates, feeding schedules, soundproofing check times. It was a business built on blood, calculated to the last second. My flashlight caught a small note in the margin, Subjects 1, 2, 3, stable. So they were still alive. They were somewhere here, behind this wall, in the cages he called subjects. And then I heard it. A faint, barely discernible sound that couldn't belong to machinery. A rhythmic tapping on metal, coming from behind the far wall of the office. Someone was signaling. At this depth, under tons of earth and marble, this sound felt like a voice from another world. I walked over to the wall and pressed my ear against the cold concrete. The tapping repeated. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS old school. It was one of the kids. They knew someone had come, or they simply hadn't lost hope. In that moment, all professional coldness evaporated, leaving only rage. I found a hidden lock behind one of the panels, another steel door leading into the darkness. I checked the round in the chamber. The time for playing hide and seek was over. I pushed the door open and entered the containment zone. The smell here was different, a mix of disinfectant and fear. 3 cages neatly built into the walls like safety deposit boxes in a vault. My flashlight beam hit the first one. There, on a narrow cot, sat Marcus, the boy from the first photograph. He looked pale, exhausted, but unharmed. On the floor stood containers with the Marble Throne logo. Elias had been feeding them the remains of delicacies from their own parents' tables. It was the ultimate degree of cynicism. Marcus covered his face from the bright light, his lips trembling, but he didn't make a sound. He was too terrified to believe in rescue. "Quiet, son," I whispered. "I'm with Sheriff Miller. We're getting you out of here." I grabbed the ring of keys I'd snatched from the office desk. My gloved fingers moved fast, sorting through them one by one until the steel slid into the slot. The click of the lock sounded like a triumph. I opened the door of the first cage and helped Marcus stand. He could barely stay on his feet, his muscles stiff from weeks in a confined space. In the second and third cages, the others began to stir. The girl, Sarah, looked at me with wide eyes full of tears. They were all here together, locked in this underground purgatory, while Elias cut letters out of newspapers upstairs. I knew we didn't have much time. If Elias saw on the monitor that he had guests in his laboratory, he wouldn't call the police. He'd come himself to clean up. "Move toward the ladder, fast but quiet," I commanded, letting them go ahead. We walked through the narrow tunnel, and every rustle sounded like thunder. The kids supported each other, their steps uncertain and their breathing heavy. From above, through the open hatch of the shed, came Rusty's sharp, warning bark. It was the signal I feared most. The dog had caught the scent of an outsider. Someone was approaching the shed from the cemetery side. I switched off the flashlight, plunging us into absolute darkness so as not to give away our position. We froze. In the silence of the tunnel, I heard the shed door slam above and Elias's heavy footsteps echoing over our heads. He was back, and he wasn't alone. I pressed a finger to my lips, staring into the darkness where the kids stood frozen. They understood without words. I slowly drew my revolver, feeling the cold metal and the weight of responsibility. From above, through the rectangle of the open hatch, a thin, aggressive beam of an outsider's flashlight pierced the darkness. Dust danced in that light, and Elias's voice, now cold and stripped of all politeness, echoed from the void. "Jack, I know you're down there. You've ruined such a beautiful evening." I heard him fumbling with something heavy above, the sound of metal on metal. He wasn't going to come down for us. He was going to lock us in here forever, by sealing the exit or cutting the air. I had to act first, and I only had one chance. The sound of grinding metal above our heads was the final piece of Elias's cold logic. He wasn't coming down to face us. He was simply closing a file. To him, we weren't people anymore. We were just inventory errors that needed to be deleted from the system. I stood there, feeling the vibration of that heavy steel plate sliding into place, sealing us in this limestone tomb. Behind me, I could hear the two boys, Marcus and Leo, struggling to keep their breathing steady, while the girl, Sarah, leaned against the cold wall, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended words. I had to be their anchor. I turned off the flashlight for a second to let my eyes adjust, and in that absolute blackness, my mind went back to the map in the office. Elias was a master of details, but he had the arrogance of a man who thinks he's the only one who can read a blueprint. He saw a dotted line on an old 1930s survey and assumed it was a dead end, a collapsed relic of the Prohibition era. But I had noticed the salt deposits on the floor and the way the air moved. There was a draft, a subtle, rhythmic pulse of air that didn't come from the hatch. I reached out and grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, my grip firm enough to snap him out of his trance. I whispered into the dark, my voice low and steady. He thinks he's buried us, but he just gave us a head start. We aren't going up, we're going deeper. We began to move, hands on shoulders, feeling our way along the cold, weeping walls. Every second felt like a minute, every heartbeat like a hammer against my ribs, but we moved as one. The technical crawl space was a nightmare of jagged masonry and stagnant water, but it was our only bridge back to the living. I led the way, my flashlight beam cutting through a fog so thick it felt like wet wool against my skin. Behind me, the three of them moved like ghosts. Leo was helping Sarah navigate the slippery gaps, while Marcus stayed close to my heels, his hand occasionally brushing my jacket to ensure I was still there. I could hear the distant, distorted echoes of Rusty's barking coming through the ventilation shafts. My dog was up there, playing his part, keeping Elias focused on the shed while we vanished beneath his feet. It was a strange sensation, walking through the forgotten veins of the city, passing through vaults that hadn't seen a human soul since the days of the bootleggers. The air began to change. The smell of old concrete and decay was slowly replaced by something sharp and metallic, the scent of the river. My logic was holding up. Elias controlled the cemetery and the restaurant, but he couldn't control the city's drainage history. He viewed this place as a static cage, but I saw it as a dynamic system. We reached a massive iron grate, its hinges swollen with a century of rust. I signaled the group to stop. This was the moment of maximum risk. If I couldn't force this open, we'd be trapped in a bottleneck with no way back. I put my shoulder against the cold iron, feeling the grit of the rust bite into my jacket. I thought about Elias's calm face, the way he adjusted his apron while children were locked in cages, and that rage gave me the strength I needed. With a groan that sounded like the earth itself was tearing, the grate gave way. The fresh air hit us like a physical wave as we emerged from the darkness of the embankment. It was 5:50 a.m., and the Texas sky was beginning to bleed into shades of violet and gold. I helped Sarah, Marcus, and Leo onto the soft grass. Their eyes squinted against the first light they had seen in weeks. They looked like ghosts, fragile and broken, but they were breathing the air of the living again. Marcus turned to look at the opening we'd just crawled through, his face a mask of disbelief, while Leo simply collapsed onto the turf, his hand gripping the blades of grass as if to prove the earth was real. My logic had held true to the very end. Elias was so focused on the silence of the cemetery that he forgot the river never stops moving. I didn't reach for my radio immediately. I stood there for a moment, watching the mist rise off the water, letting the realization sink in. We were out. But the job wasn't finished. I pulled my phone from my pocket and made the call I had been waiting to make since I first saw those tire tracks. Miller answered on the first ring, his voice thick with sleep and tension. I gave him the coordinates of the river outlet and told him to send the ambulances. No sirens, no lights. We needed a silent perimeter. Elias was likely still at the shed, perhaps even listening for the sound of fading oxygen in the tomb he thought he'd created. Get the teams to the restaurant and the cemetery, I told Miller, and tell them to be ready. He won't go quietly, but he will go. By 7 a.m., the Marble Throne District was crawling with federal agents and local PD. The arrest was clinical, just the way Elias would have appreciated it if it weren't happening to him. They found him in the restaurant kitchen, calmly preparing the morning's prep work as if the world hadn't collapsed beneath his feet. He didn't fight. He just looked at the handcuffs, then at Miller, and finally out the window toward the cemetery. He knew exactly where the failure in his logic had occurred. I sat in my truck, watching the circus from a distance. My body ached, and the smell of the tunnel was still etched into my skin, but the weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks was finally gone. I picked up the tiny scrap of paper from the dashboard, the letter M. Such a small thing to bring down a man who thought he was a ghost. Elias had built a kingdom of shadows, a perfect inventory of suffering. But he forgot that justice doesn't follow a spreadsheet. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and sometimes it comes from a man and a dog who refuse to stop looking. Sarah, Marcus, and Leo were with their families now, safe. I started the engine, the familiar rumble of the truck grounding me in the present. The silence of the graveyard was finally just silence again. As I drove away from the district, I realized that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by logic alone. They require a bit of instinct and a lot of heart. The case was closed, but the memory of those tapping sounds against the stone would stay with me forever.